Greg, the Global Deputy Editorial Director of Wired.
You got it.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. It took a lot of practice. You cover how technology will impact culture, the economy, politics. Tech is in everything these days. It's not even just a tech topic. Tech infiltrates everything. You're a very experienced moderator, having interviewed some of the most high-profile, prolific, and influential thought leaders. So can you just give us a brief sort of summary of your journey and who you are?
I've always wanted to be a writer. I was a bit of a nerdy kid. I would buy newspapers on my way to work. On my way to school when everyone else was, buying sweets and mucking about on the bus. I'd sit there earnestly reading newspapers. Eventually ended up in New York, where I was editing kind of long form, a title that no longer exists. But there was something going on in the background, and that thread was one I was really interested in exploring. We used to do a thing called the power list, the annual power list. We looked at the most important people at that point in US culture and US cultural life, and it became really apparent, and this is probably around 2006, 2007, that there was this new breed of person, and they were people who were running technology companies. And I increasingly became interested in these companies because I thought, hang on a second, they are redefining every industry and also accruing enormous amounts of power and huge amounts of influence. So when a job at Wired came up, I kind of leapt at the chance and I joined Wired in 2009. And since then have been, covering technology, business, science, but tech covers everything now. I mean, and I think that like back in the day, we would have titles like, digital marketing or digital advertising or digital editors. We no longer use the word digital, right? Everything is necessarily, digital by default. And I think that, we're seeing this in every aspect of our lives, both personally and in terms of our every industry. So it's, for me, the greatest story of our era is the impact that tech is having on the world.
What worries you most about this space, and what excites you the most about this space?
I think that genuinely we are finding ways of solving very, very significant problems. If you look at healthcare, the way that technology is enabling us to do things like decode the genome, which initially when we first tried to do that cost like billions and billions of dollars. You can now do it for $200 roughly. There is a company in Oxford Nanopore, where you can do it in the field with a device that's the size of a mobile phone. So that is very exciting. We're seeing deep scientific breakthroughs, companies like Google DeepMind, some of the work they've done on AlphaFold. And that was a deep scientific problem. It had been a grand challenge, as they call them, that had been 50 years. No one had been able to solve that challenge. DeepMind through AlphaFold did it a couple of years ago, and they predicted the way that proteins would fold. We're seeing enormous gains in areas like climate. So you just look at the cost of, say, a commodity like solar panels. That is dropping through the floor. Cost of electricity have decreased, multiple times. I think they're like 5% of what they were 20 years ago. So we're seeing these huge gains, which are really, really exciting. But then I think it's really fair to say that we are seeing challenges around power and the accruing of that power, how that power is used. The many large technology companies are effectively monopolies, and that is not good for all kinds of reasons. That doesn't allow small businesses to flourish. It means they have enormous market power that necessarily means that they can accrue further power. And I think that there are big challenges around how this is going to play out in the next few years. We're already seeing the rise of, we've seen over the last few years, the rise of things like misinformation, disinformation, and we're seeing the way that like technology can be used by bad actors as well as the good guys. So, it's like, it really is like anything. It can be used for good. It can be used by bad actors. And, telling the stories around that and trying to understand the kind of like the spheres of influence and the power around that is a really exciting place to be.
It is exciting, but it's also quite it's scary that people always look to governments and global leaders as the most powerful people in the world. But now the most powerful people in the world, in a sense, are the owners of these tech companies. They almost control people's brains, their preferences, what they view, what content gets fed to them.
Yep.
It's all quite scary. So on the topic of tech sovereignty, how can that be navigated?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think tech sovereignty is increasingly, I think one of the areas that I'm really interested in and I speak on is geopolitics, technology and geopolitics, and how geopolitics is shaping technology and how technology is shaping geopolitics. And we can see that being the way that that's kind of being kind of worked out at the moment through the relationship between the administration in the United States and China. But there are multiple other players in this, like, pretty much every kind of like developed economy and many emerging economies are involved in this. Okay, so tech sovereignty, just for people who don't know, that's how you develop, deploy, and control technology, right? And that's basically a nation state and how they're thinking about it. And there are many reasons you might want to do this at the moment. You might not want a foreign-owned business to run your technology stack in your country.
Yeah, it's happening with Trump right now, really.
National security reasons, exactly.
Yeah.
Or you might be held hostage because, they decide not to give you some kind of an update to your software because they don't like whoever is in power in your country and they want to influence those decisions.
Yeah.
So we're increasingly seeing different approaches to this. We're seeing, obviously, US technology companies, incredibly powerful, the most powerful companies that have ever existed. 7 of the 10 most powerful companies, by market cap, are US technology companies, right? These are very, very, very powerful organizations. But we're also seeing the rise of many other approaches towards this. So China has an ambition to be the world's most advanced country when it comes to artificial intelligence by 2030.
Who is right now? Is it America?
You could say it's the US, but like China is so close behind, and the EU is probably kind of coming in a slightly distant
Not doing
third.
too badly.
But I think that you can argue that there are many good things in the EU. I think that some people in the United States would argue that the AI Act and will stifle innovation, but there are many others, among them Mustafa Suleyman, one of the co-founders of Google DeepMind, and now runs AI at Microsoft, who would argue that actually the AI Act is the kind of the gold standard of how we need to think about regulating AI moving forward.
Yeah.
But the idea of sovereignty, I think, is a really important one, and obviously we're seeing this play out at the moment. I mean, China thought, around 30, 40 years that it wanted to dominate, had an ambition, didn't think, it acted, had an ambition to dominate the technologies of the 21st century. You could argue that it's pretty much achieving its goals when you look at the way that it dominates things like battery technology, solar technology, material science, EVs. There are obviously very, very impressive businesses in the US as well. But when you think about the way that the Chinese government has invested to ensure that they have a kind of dominance in these sectors, and then we have an administration at the moment in the United States that's literally thinking about the technology of the 20th century. So let's go back to internal combustion engines. Let's go back to drilling for oil and gas. So, you have a very different mindset there in terms of what that kind of sovereignty looks like and what that market dominance looks like. Then you have other, very ambitious countries like India at the moment, super interesting. They really want autonomy. They're doing it using tech autonomy. They're using it, doing open source, using open source, I should say. What's interesting there now is if you want to run a technology company in India, you have to have the data stored within the geographical limits of India. And that's super interesting because, we hear about the TikTok ban in the United States. Actually, India was the first country to ban TikTok because it was concerned about sort of like the data sovereignty.
Yeah.
Then you're seeing countries, I think the Middle East is somewhere that's super interesting right now, developing sovereign AI and different approaches that maybe are kind of like more culturally appropriate. So you see Mistral in France, you see Aleph Alpha in Germany, thinking about, okay, what does a German AI product look like? Or what does a French AI product look like? How do we make this culturally relevant for our citizens. So there is a lot going on with tech sovereignty. I think it will be one of the big stories moving forward, like how states navigate their own purposes for their own ambitions and their own economic autonomy.
Yeah.
And security as well, I should have said. Yeah.
So being at the forefront of tech trends.
Yes.
It almost feels like whiplash. You get so excited about the metaverse, you get so excited about all these big trends that come up, and then suddenly it dies down. I haven't heard the word metaverse in about a year.
Yeah.
So how can like an average reader or sort of corporations navigate hype, major hype versus fad? What will stick, what won't stick, and what are you seeing right now in your trend forecasting that you think we should all be aware of?
It's a really great question. And I think I'd probably back up and say that if we were in 1995 and thinking about the internet, would we have been able to imagine what that would look like in 30 years? I mean, the chances are, we would have got maybe one or two things right. So we would have said, okay, this free flow of information probably isn't good for the news business. And that has proven to be the case. But could you have imagined, I don't know, something like Airbnb? Could you have imagined something like Netflix? It takes a long, long time for these trends to work through. So I think that, if we could know what, technology is going to be like in 25, 30 years, that we would be in another realm, right? So we don't really know. And I think that there are hype cycles. There's three things we know. We know the semiconductor industry is cyclical. We know that technology, when it's commodified, it basically goes to like, marginal cost. So right now the cost of, producing software is pretty much zero, especially with the rise of generative AI. And we know that, that what we tend to do with technologies is we plug them in to the way that we're already working at the moment, right? We don't take that next step and think, okay, so what are the big shifts that are going to happen? What are the companies of the future? What are the applications of this technology that are really going to change the game? What we do is we say, hey, this thing's really cool. Let's kind of like try and use it in a way that is, that fits the way that we're working at the moment. So a really good example would be something like, I don't know, Adobe software. Adobe's been around for a long time, but we couldn't operate it in our browser, right? But suddenly when we operated it in our browser, it was a different thing to the product that we used beforehand. So I guess my answer to your question is like, we don't know, but what we can predict is that there will be huge hype cycles around anything where there are large amounts of money. And technology, obviously, there is, as I said earlier, 7 of the world's 10 most valuable companies are technology companies. So there is always going to be this hype cycle. And, there's the famous Gartner hype cycle of, the expectations and delivery kind of like not being what it should be. And then the kind of like the trough of disappointment around these things. I would say, you mentioned the metaverse. I think the metaverse is something that people wanted to imagine was going to be transformative. I think that you could argue that it has been, if you are a fan of Minecraft or you're a fan of sort of like some of these sort of very, very sort of, involved multiplayer games. But I don't think we've seen applications on a consumer level, and we haven't seen applications on an industrial level beyond sort of like some pretty basic applications. I would argue that there's the hardware has not broken through, which is why, for instance, Meta is investing so heavily in its partnership with Ray-Bans with the glasses. They want to make this happen.
I think those glasses look so ugly. I really do. I'll never wear them. But I do think it's quite cool. Are you concerned about the future of news? How do you see the role of journalism evolving?
Great question. Look, ever since I've been in the industry, I've been told that the industry is in crisis. Like, this has been a constant throughout my entire career. I think that we are seeing a number of different factors happening right now around the fact that, news to some degree has been commodified. So you have to think about how you stand out. You have to think about how do you provide your audience with information that's trustworthy, because that's the key for me, the key commodity. There's a big kind of concern in the news business at the moment that AI, generative AI in particular, things like Google overviews will impact what we do. And there's a big question around IP, and I do think that the news business needs to be incredibly robust with big tech around this, and certainly we're seeing all kinds of lawsuits. But I think it's also we have to, as a kind of a general sort of like culture, and I mean this kind of like liberal democracies, we have to think about what kind of news ecosystem do we want. And so when people are sort of like sharing misinformation on that's produced on social media platforms, people should like think about their responsibility as well. Like how do you be a responsible user of social media? The challenge is that really shouldn't fall on the consumer. That should fall on the big tech companies, and in my view, we're not doing enough to ensure that they have the responsibility around that, to ensure that our news ecosystem is not polluted by misinformation.
And extremes.
Platforms have a responsibility around this. And just like just as we have laws around hate speech, I think that we need to ensure that we are ensuring that these are robustly enforced on social media. But the trouble is that we largely enable a lot of these platforms to self-police, and they decided against this. So when Meta decides, for instance, not to have content moderation any longer, guess what happens? The platforms become ever more toxic. So that is one of the challenges around how we keep people well informed with trusted journalism and news. But it is kind of rather dismal that we've had 9 different congressional hearings and there's 0 legislation that's been passed. Although it does look from most recent congressional hearing like Meta might get broken up, but we'll see. Probably not.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Okay, so you've interviewed the most incredible people, from the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of LinkedIn, PM Tony Blair, PM Boris Johnson, CEO of BMW, and the list goes on and on and on. So looking back at your career of sitting down with some of these like people that have changed the world, what interview stands out? What's been your favorite interview and why?
I mean, I've been very fortunate. I have met a lot of extraordinary people. I mean, I think so. Demis Hassabis is one of the. He's just won a Nobel Prize for his work around AlphaFold, which I mentioned earlier on. The Nobel Prize for Chemistry is an incredibly impressive person, and he's now running the whole of Google DeepMind, and a lot of the work that they're doing is extraordinary in terms of the way that they're solving really big scientific challenges. I really liked meeting Satya Nadella because he'd taken over Microsoft at quite a difficult time for the company, and he completely changed the culture of the company, and he made very smart bets. He bet on AI and he bet on cloud. And Microsoft had been through a tough time. They missed out on mobile. He's made some very smart acquisitions. They obviously have a big investment in OpenAI. I think he's an interesting character as well because he has challenging sort of like family circumstances with children who are disabled, and I think that gives him a kind of like that gives him a sort of like a broader sense of what it is to be a human being. Which you don't always get from incredibly powerful tech executives, and he had a sense of responsibility, I think, as well. And I think he, genuinely is an incredibly impressive leader. But yeah, I mean, and I think Tony Blair is incredibly charismatic and very thoughtful. And if you look at the work that they're doing at the Tony Blair Institute around technology, they're pretty, one of the leading now. I would argue like think tanks, But also what they're doing, which is interesting, is they're moving from being a think tank to actually building applications. So they're working to think about, okay, what does it mean to have to try and deliver the tools that governments need now in order to deliver services better.
So you've interviewed all these incredible people.
Yes.
You've worked with like the World Economic Forum, UN AI for Good. You really do, you are at the forefront of technology trends at Wired. So in a nutshell, why do you think your perspective is so valuable to corporations and governments?
I think when you're in an organization, whether that's government, which by the way is really, really hard, like government is a really, really tough thing to do.
Yeah.
Or you're in a large organization that maybe has, very specific goals and its own culture. It's really good to look beyond that culture. It's really good to, get the viewpoints of people who are maybe out in the world, meeting people, whether they're investors or entrepreneurs or designers or people working in other organizations, and think about and just asking questions about those organizations is crucial to their ability to do their jobs and understand what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
So I think that I am fortunate. I get to meet a lot of incredibly sort of smart people, and hopefully, when I encounter people in government or when I encounter people in large organizations, I can maybe share some of what I've learned, but also a lot of it is just asking the right questions, right? And then because they can very easily go to a consulting company. That consulting company is very likely going to try and sell them something, probably a bit of software. There'll be something that there'll be a pain point that they can identify, and then they can hopefully solve for them. But I think that being out in the world, meeting lots of people who are doing exciting things and really genuinely changing the world gives you a viewpoint where hopefully you can intersect and provide a company or an organization with a fresh viewpoint.
So lovely to meet you, and thank you for coming, and thank you to everybody on the live stream. Goodbye.
Thank you for joining us.